Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's the 11th of May, 2012, and this is the weekly podcast that we do on Audrey Waters' Hack Education blog posts. Hi, Audrey.
Hello, happy Friday.
Happy Friday. And this is fun, too, because in addition to your own blog posts, you're highlighting some other posts.
I am.
Yeah. So let's talk about that first, if you would. You've changed the structure of your site a little, which also includes this other news piece. What changes have you made?
Well, for a long time I had, well, not for that long, I guess Tumblr isn't that old, but I had started using Tumblr to collect various links that I was sharing and highlighting and making some comments on what other education bloggers were writing about. And for a number of reasons, I decided to sort of bring that back in-house, least of which being I'm becoming increasingly reluctant to sort of invest too much of my energy and my efforts and my data into third-party services that are what I like to call sort of the Hotel California of the web, right? So you can check in, but you can never check out. And Tumblr doesn't do a very good job of data portability. And so I decided to add a new feature to the site where I'm doing a very similar thing. I'm just, it's also, I think I would say, modeled on Stephen Downs' Online Learning Daily, the newsletter that he sends out. We're just collecting links, making some comments on them, and wanting to highlight some of the other folks who are thinking and writing about similar issues as I am.
The draft of the EdTech news that you sent me had some posts that weren't included in the other news section yet.
Right.
Is it your intention to keep those in parallel?
I'll probably keep those in parallel. It's also just a matter of rejiggering my sort of workflow and remembering where I've written and where I should be writing things now. Just new workflow.
Well, when we get to that section of the newsletter, I am going to then actually kind of shift into some of those other stories.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can kind of encompass them both.
Yes.
Okay, so when school internet filters follow you home, felt to me like there are sort of two issues from this story, right? One is overprotection in the actual school or library environment, and the other is extending that protection or overprotection to outside of school.
Yeah, I think that many educators have for a long time sort of questioned whether or not schools are filtering too much. The requirements for schools and libraries that receive E-rate funding is to have some filters to block objectionable pornographic content, to monitor students' internet usage. But oftentimes, as many people know, what happens is lots more websites get blocked, particularly social websites, sites like Facebook, even sites like YouTube, which I think most folks would agree has a ton of educational video content. Nevertheless, they're blocked at school. But what we're finding now, particularly with the rise of mobile devices, is that that schools are coming up with new ways of filtering, not just having filters on the school networks themselves, but discussing ways to put those filters onto devices directly. And those are devices that students sometimes take home with them, which means that the same sites that you can't reach at school, you could not reach at home if you're using school property.
So if I had to guess, I would guess that there are two kind of large gorillas in the room here. One is using SIPA or these regulations as an excuse for blocking things that are considered to be time wasters or distractions.
Right. And
the other would be the incredible role that parents' perceptions have in school policies.
Yeah, this is a really interesting issue to me, and I've asked the FCC for clarity on it as well. Partially because I think that you can read SIPA, and it's just not clear whether or not schools are obligated to have filters on devices that students take home and that are accessing their parents, or accessing the internet through their parents' internet, if you will. And so that question then of whose responsibility is it to filter content? And what's fascinating is that parents, in a couple of the cases that I look at in this story, it's parents who are complaining that students are bypassing filters at home, or that students are spending too much time on Facebook at home, which is a very interesting thing to then push back onto the school and have the school mandate that there are filters.
And we've talked about this ad nauseum now, but certainly fear leads to control, a sense of capability would lead to some form of agency or teaching, right? So it feels like this is very fear-driven.
It is fear-driven, and I think it's also, I think we're seeing this increasing penchant for sort of for surveillance. We've talked about the case of the student who was expelled from school for cursing via Twitter, even though he wasn't at school when the profanity occurred. And last week we talked as well about now New York City school teachers as well having their social media profiles monitored or potentially monitored by their employers. And so it seems to me this cultural moment as well where we're using SIPA to justify surveillance over what teachers and students are doing on the internet.
So tell me how I do with this. Evgeny Morozov?
Yes.
Was I even close?
Yes.
So his book, Net Delusion,
Have
talks
you read
about
that?
this. It's on my shelf. I was really glad you mentioned it because I was like, I have to pick that up.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't think that he doesn't talk at all about education in his book. I mean, he's talking mostly about this he calls it sort of the net freedom, the sort of utopian vision that access to the internet will lead to democracy, and he looks at ways in which actually the internet is being used to crack down on democracy in multiple ways. But it was just, his book really has been making me think a lot about, again, this moment where we're thinking about the ways in which the internet and new technologies can be this really democratic, this moment where we're democratizing education, and just thinking about through this lens that he provides, really, are we paying enough attention to the ways in which we're actually perpetuating sort of surveillance alongside the democracy?
So SIPA's over 10 years old by now.
Yes.
It feels like we do have, a slightly different perspective than we did 11 years ago. It also feels like there is value in kind of the cultural negotiations that take place here, right? That we have a perception of danger or fear. There's a larger discussion that takes place. Is this just kind of the normal progress of things? I mean, can we feel okay that we're actually making some progress?
I think that this is one of the many areas now in which we're realizing that the law is just not keeping pace with the speed with which technology is changing, but culture is changing as well. I mean, I think that the trio of laws that we often talk about in terms of education technology, SIPA, COPPA, and FERPA, are decades old. I mean, so SIPA 2001, COPPA, I can't recall, I think 2003, FERPA, I think is in 1973. So these are pieces of legislation that really don't reflect the web, let alone Web 2.0. And I think that this is a challenging moment in other areas as well, in terms of what we're seeing around copyright and patents and just this massive change and how the law just doesn't reflect the way in which we have our culture has changed immensely.
So is there anybody who's doing this well, having this dialogue in their communities well, where you've seen an outcome where you feel like this actually strengthened the community to have this conversation and figure out how to manage the internet in schools?
I think that this is the other piece of SIPA, of course, is that schools are required to have an internet safety policy, and that is something that should be developed ideally should be developed in dialogue with the community, with the administrators, with the teachers, with the parents, perhaps with the students as well. And I do think that some schools really are having good discussions about this. I mean, there are, I think, more schools that are recognizing that the heavy-handedness around filtering not only isn't necessary, but it's actually detrimental in a lot of ways. Not just that students can't access content, but that students aren't learning how to sort of be good citizens, if you will, on the web. And so I do think that there is some shifting, but again, until things, if things aren't shifting in the law, I think that SIPA will continue to be the sort of go-to justification for cracking down hard on access.
I have loved it every time I hear of a program where the students organize evenings where they teach the parents about what they're learning about on the internet at school.
Yes.
To kind of bring this thing full cycle. Okay, so tell us some things, Audrey, that you've learned about MOOCs and how you learn.
Well, I mean, I am trying really hard to sort of not be the serial MOOC dropout. I just completed week 3 of Coursera's Intro to Computer Science class. But I'm really struggling with it, and I'm at the stage now where it's not that I'm not interested in CS. I'm really interested in learning more about computer science, not just programming per se, but more about computer science. But I'm recognizing that I don't like lectures. I have a hard time paying attention to the Coursera lectures that are sometimes 20-minute long explanations. I just tend to, my mind tends to wander when I'm listening to them, and I end up not paying attention. And I've also recognized sort of how much I like learning with other people, and being in this particular MOOC and in the Udacity MOOC as well, I really feel that I'm alone in a class of 100,000 people. Despite the size of the student population, it's a very lonely enterprise, which is perhaps counterintuitive, but it's I think pretty indicative of the way in which these classes are being operated. Is that you are very much learning alone.
So it's kind of like walking into a large ballroom at a conference. There are 100,000 people in the ballroom. You sit down, you don't know your neighbors on either side, and you're just lectured at.
Yes. I mean, I think that it's a missed opportunity in a number of ways, and I think that it's also, partially because of the reliance on forums as the social component of these particular classes. Only certain kinds of students I think really gravitate to forums. Sort of not to put on my sociologist hat, but I think there's a certain internet culture around forums that may or may not be particularly positive. And I think that if you aren't someone who likes forums or can navigate forums, that it's really not that helpful. That would be like the one social place, and it's not how I socialize on the internet.
The platform matters.
The platform really matters, and this is, I don't know if you've been participating in the Open Bonk class. The
Open Bonk class.
Sorry, that's the hashtag. Open Bonk is the hashtag. That's Kurt Bonk's class that's being offered through Blackboard. It's one of Blackboard's open sites. And I think Lisa Lane wrote a really great post about why she was dropping out of this class. And a lot of her complaints were around, again, this legacy platform in terms of Blackboard, which again focuses on discussion forums, and that there's something about the the platform in which these Coursera and Udacity and MITx courses are being offered that really feels like an old LMS. It really feels like Blackboard, and again, I just don't, if you're used to chatting with folks via Twitter, if you're used to blogging on your own blog, participating with a community of learners, that the LMS feels like a step backwards. And I think that these massive classes again we've talked about this numerous times, but that they really are failing to generate community.
I'm really glad you're bringing that up again, and it's recharged my batteries on a project that I've wanted to do for a couple of years now, but a really good interview series with leaders of educational communities about what they do to keep those communities a place of interaction and learning. And I guess I didn't make the connection that would actually be really valuable potentially to the communities that get formed around these MOOCs.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about even something like P2PU, which isn't massive in the same scale of the Stanford classes, but it is still this open online courses. And I feel as though P2PU does a great job around community. And so, but thinking again, how does the platform even on P2PU sort of hinder the development of community? Are we so accustomed now to the social network sort of model that something that feels courses online still feel really restricted when they're sort of forced into a particular website where all learning and action and are supposed to take place on a website and not on the web?
Okay, so Mathalicious has this ambitious goal we've talked about, raising money on Kickstarter. Kickstarter doesn't require that the organization in any way pay back the investors, right?
Right. This is right.
So this is a lot of money for people just to sort of give, and my sense is that some things catch and some things don't.
Right.
So is there a lesson here with regard to Mathalicious, and it's not really sort of going viral yet, that points out a difference between projects that get funding and projects that don't? I've really been stewing on this a lot this week, partially because of this other gangbusters campaign on Kickstarter for the Pebble eWatch, which is a watch that will connect via Bluetooth to your iPhone and show you the time and let you control your stereo through your watch. And you are very thrilled with this, I could tell.
I'm not particularly excited about this. I'm not a watch wearer. But this has raised over $10 million, and so for what is it's a working prototype of this watch, and so it's been interesting to see. Like the initial ask for the Pebble eWatch was $100,000, and they've raised $10 million. And the initial ask for Mathalicious was, I think, $160,000, and they've raised $20. And so I have been thinking a lot about: is it that people don't feel that there's something rewarding? The reward of participating in the Pebble eWatch campaign is that you'd get this watch. The reward of participating in a Mathalicious campaign is that you help math teachers teach math better. I mean, I don't know if that's not sort of a sexy enough sale for people to have it go viral, or sort of what the problem is. But it's been really interesting again to see too the overwhelming support for this project from math teachers. So math teachers paying, donating out of pocket again. You see teachers spending money out of their pockets for something that they know works, something that they like, something that they would buy and use in their classroom, and yet sort of the rest of the world not really paying attention.
Certainly there's a difference between Kickstarter funds and venture capital,
Yes.
but they both fall into the category of requiring investment money to do something for the public good.
Right.
Or at least if we see education as a public good. So it felt to me like this is kind of a moment of lesson, right? That some of the things that are most important to do are not necessarily the ones that are going to get funding or produce revenue.
I think
and just a reminder that it's of the dangers potentially of putting education into a profit category.
I think that's precisely. I mean, that's precisely the thing. At the same time that I've seen, Kickstarter. Mathalicious raised $20,000 on Kickstarter. You hear news throughout the week of startups raising, millions of dollars in seed round from investors, and I don't think I know of a single startup that's really doing a single venture-backed startup that's doing quite the same thing that Kareem Ani is doing with Mathalicious. That is sort of teacher professional development around math education. And so, is it that's something that venture capitalists don't want to fund? They don't see that as being the next, billion-dollar idea. And so, I think that this is, how do we fund educational projects? Through philanthropy, through our property tax, through Kickstarter, right? Through crowdfunding, through VC. None of these models seem to be very satisfying.
Interesting. Well worth continuing to talk about. So I want to save your news for the very end. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to go through your other news blog posts.
Yeah.
Plus the blog posts that are at the end of your actual newsletter. So I've already talked about Lisa Lane and her experience with the Curtis Bonk Open course.
Yes.
Tell us about David Wiley and talking about sort of the true purposes of education.
Do you mean the David Wiley and Stephen Downes back and forth?
It's the Stephen Downes.
Yeah, this was an interesting one. So Stephen Downes or David Wiley wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago where he was asking for clarification about what Stephen Downes meant when he argued that learning was meant to sort of diminish the need for experts. And Stephen Downes responded with I thought was a really great a great explanation of his vision of how the difference between sort of experts and elites and empowerment, and how ideally the end of the post he talks about it's the same thing as sort of teaching someone to read so they can read for themselves. And we want to have a practice in which we can empower people to become learners, not that we want to sort of charge them to sit in the classroom and learn from us. But actually, ideally, we do want to work towards this notion of not having to rely on experts, but rather having people be able to sort of create their own expertise, create their own knowledge, and do so sort of self-sustainably and with self-reliance. I thought it was a really good view, and I think one of those things that sort of makes it clear why I think Stephen Downes' insights are particularly important with thinking about sort of the things we talk about too with agency and learners' agency that seems to so often be forgotten.
Thanks for clarifying that the post was actually Stephen's. I misread the synopsis. So this sort of brings me back to this whole question of education as liberation versus education as training. And certainly we do both, but it feels like we've maybe lost that sense that was behind the liberal arts idea that education helps you to rise above and see things more clearly and frees you in some way as a person.
I think I've noticed that now more than ever, and I'm not sure sort of what it is about this particular moment that makes that the case. You hear so often now, particularly with the economy, that the traditional liberal arts degrees are getting sort of blasted as being, the college students shouldn't major in the liberal arts, that we mock the English major. We mock the art history major. Instead, you want to do something that appeals to that there's a strong job market, which is, I think that's not always the way in which we've thought about higher ed in particular. It's not job training, that it is about sort of a sensibility, developing an intellectual sensibility for moving through the world. And so I'm not sure what it is about this particular moment that the liberal arts is and sort of an intellectual life even is sort of under attack.
Well, where was it you told this? I have this wonderful picture of you sitting in an English colloquium, reading out loud to each other and acting out parts of a play. Was that must have been in one of your posts this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's probably why I don't like the lectures. I think.
Oh, that's what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's. I recognize that in sort of my own disciplinary background as well. That I like to talk. I like to participate. I like to sort of act things out and not just sit and listen.
So our good friend Bill Fitzgerald does some calculations about the AP tests.
Yeah, well, it was funny because you and I talked about the College Board being so wildly profitable, the nonprofit being so wildly profitable last week, and Bill's calculations, well timed. He did some napkin math about how much money the students must be paying to take the AP class, which was pretty astounding. He estimates that the class of 2011 has paid over $215 million to take AP exams this year.
Wow.
Yeah, we're in the wrong business. I guess you just got to get in the business of testing, Steve. That's where the money's at.
Yeah, I'm not making a change.
Me neither.
Okay, so the Room for Debate section of the New York Times, not the same stilted debate as usual, right?
Yeah, this was sometimes the Room for Debate is. I think it's an interesting piece because I know I've talked to folks who've contributed things, and you sort of write it blindly, and it's a debate where you have no idea who you're debating or what stance other people are taking, and it feels. I think sometimes it's a hard argument to make. This was sort of a response to the Harvard edX announcement. And one of the posts that I thought was most interesting was the response from Walter Lewin, the MIT physics professor. I would say, I think in all fairness, probably the most famous professor in the world, thanks to his YouTube lecture, or the most watched professor in the world, thanks to his YouTube lectures, which, considering that background, I thought his argument for hands-on, in-person learning were wonderful, but sort of ironic at the same time.
So what is the role in a MOOC-frenzied world of the professor?
This was an interesting piece by Stephen Carson from MIT OpenCourseWare and Philip Schmidt from PDPU, and sort of thinking about the role of the professor. I would say in some of these classes, the role of the professor feels very much the same as the role of the professor in the class. That is, if you're relying on the lecture model, it is still a professor-centric, professor-centric way of teaching. And I think that these are the sort of, I think we're really seeing clearly now the ways in which some of the MOOCs, and historically the connectivist MOOCs, were far more learner-centered. And the professor, the professor still plays a key role in the Coursera, in the Udacity. It was funny, this morning I recorded a different podcast. They kept telling me I had to say Udacity.
What? Is that correct?
No, it's Udacity. But now that's stuck in my head. Udacity, MITx, in which it really does feel like the lecture model, just the supersized lecture model with the professor still in control.
Interesting. Okay, an article from the Music for Deck Chairs blog.
Yes.
Who is that?
Kate Boyle, I think that's her last name. Kate Boyle. She's an Australian professor, and she's one of my favorite bloggers, partially because I think that there's a danger. If there's a danger of being too Silicon Valley centric when it comes to ed tech, I think there even more so. There's a danger of being too North American centric, and so I love reading Kate because she is a great reminder of in sort of other ways of thinking about education, and that when we talk about sort of globalization, that there are other systems. Globalization, the global opportunities around education. How are we sort of colonizing other places, other institutions through education technology? But anyway, she had an interesting blog post, sort of thinking about how universities sort of how they could do a better job with agility and experimentation and learning from failure.
This was really interesting for me because we often think that if we just show the best of something, that people will kind of just blindly adopt it
right.
and make it their own. And we'll say, well, we've shown you the best. Why haven't you done it? And for me, it raised not only the issues sort of the need for failure and kind of showcasing failures, but really for an understanding of process and involvement, meaning don't give me the list of 10 things that every 21st century learner needs. Give me the outline of how you hold a community discussion to come up with 10 things that you believe.
Yes.
And that really resonates with me, just this understanding that learning is a process, not just, and again, there are parallels here. You're not just something you can dump on someone else.
Exactly. No, and I think that's, then that's what's so, I think, one of the things that we're seeing right now, particularly with the edX announcement and a potential rivalry with Coursera, is thinking about that seems to be like this silver bullet, this sort of MOOC silver bullet, and how instead can institutions, faculty, students have these conversations around what the processes and thinking about what it means to teach and learn in a new. With new networks through the web, rather than just sort of replicating, well, we must replicate that model because Harvard did it.
Okay, so in your, I think these are the ones that are at the end of your newsletter, there's a blog post from Doug Holton on what's the problem with MOOCs. Anything we haven't covered yet?
I think that he's sort of identifying, again, this thing that we've talked about before, that the ones that are getting a lot of the attention right now are this sort of traditional lecture-based courses, and before we get sort of too excited about how this is going to, quote, revolutionize education, like really, what's different in this scenario? Is it because certainly in some ways the teaching and learning isn't transformed or necessarily transformative.
Okay, and then who is illiterate?
Oh, Michael Feldstein.
Michael Feldstein on what are ed tech entrepreneurs good for?
Yeah. This was his response to the education.
Your epic rant.
Yeah, the Education Innovation Summit at ASU a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that he was making the case that he felt as though that there was a difference between entrepreneurs in education who needed to have a strong education background, who were dealing with teaching and learning, who needed to have a strong education background, those who didn't. He sort of made an argument that he felt as though that sort of the entrepreneurs were very passionate individuals who wanted to make a change, and I felt he was sort of making the argument that to give to ed tech entrepreneurs the benefit of the doubt, that these are to not have the conversation just be about what the investors want, what the politicians want, but really sort of that there are some great entrepreneurs who who are prepared to sort of make a difference here.
I think we've talked about this before, and I think you've raised the value of an entrepreneur who truly cares to serve a market and takes their cues from that market and then rapidly iterates to match the actual needs. That seems like that's a really healthy process.
Yeah.
Versus, here's a product that we think is going to make a lot of money, and we're not really spending time with educators to figure out what they need. We have a model that we think potentially could be explosive in terms of financial growth.
Right. I mean, and I think that not to bring this back to some of the Mathalicious, the questions around Mathalicious as well. I mean, it is really interesting to see the entrepreneurs that are entering the education space right now, and those who do so with an education background, those who do so without, those who move in with a great deal of humility, I think, who are willing to listen to teachers, and those who are certain that they've solved a problem because education is broken and they're going to fix it.
Okay, and then finally, there's this EDUCAUSE post. If I've got the right one, this is actually looks like a fully downloadable collection.
This is a new book, and I haven't read all the way through it yet. This is their title of Game Changers, and it's a look at what universities have done in terms of education technology on campus. There's a lot of articles in it. They're all quite short, but a ton of material about what various universities are doing to adopt ed tech.
Well, you've given me my interview invitation list for the next year, it looks like.
Yeah, I think so.
That's educause.edu/game-changers. And also will be in your newsletter. Okay, so let's switch to the newsletter.
Yes.
Let me get there. Okay, so Maurice Sendak passes away.
Yes, I have so many fond memories as a child and as a parent of Maurice Sendak that I couldn't help but sort of feel like I had to mention him. And when I post the story tomorrow morning, I will have, I think, an image of my most favorite moment in Where the Wild Things Are, where Max starts to imagine his bedroom changes into the forest. And I sort of love the imagination and anarchy of that book.
So not making any connection between monsters and anarchy, Stanford and Pearson are working on a new licensing procedure?
That's a nice segue. Yes, they are. This is, here we go. Not a week goes by where Pearson, there's not some piece of news that Pearson has its fingers in so many pies. But they're working on a new way to license teachers that is to be accepted in multiple states, that requires you submitting a video of classroom performance and answering a multiple choice test. And this is in lieu of traditionally how classroom licensing occurs, in which your teacher mentors, the schools in which your student teacher or perhaps your professors in college actually evaluate you. More testing, another new testing regime that Pearson is poised to introduce. But I should add that students at University of Massachusetts are protesting, and the education department there is refusing to participate. Interesting.
As the parent whose 8th grade daughter is starting to take some of the Utah State tests that relate to both No Child Left Behind and Common Core State standards, I've sort of watched firsthand the unintended consequences and the potentially negative outcomes of these kinds of high-stake regular tests. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that there has been some pushback on Common Core State standards. What kind of pushback is it, and what are the arguments?
I think this is interesting, considering that the number of groups that were sort of initially pushing for the Common Core State standard, which would as the name suggests, so that all of the states in the country in the U.S. have the same standards, other than individual states being able to set their own curriculum, set their own standards. Now, several states are balking at this, arguing that it's going to be a national curriculum, and are making moves to not participate. Utah, in fact, Utah is one of them.
Interesting. Anything more to say on that in particular?
I mean, I think it's, it is interesting to me because of the role in particular of publishing companies and testing companies that are interested in this as well. And so it's an interesting divide between some conservative states in particular that seem to be conservative politically, states that seem to be pushing back on this move.
Okay, AT&T and Verizon and some others didn't actually give schools the discounts that they were supposed to through the E-rate program?
Yeah, this is an interesting. This is the ironic coda, I suppose, to the story earlier about SIPA, right? Because the whole point of SIPA is for schools that get E-rate funding, which is a discount on their telecommunications and internet services, are mandated to have this filtering and monitoring. Come to find out, thanks to ProPublica investigation and several states, that it appears as though AT&T and Verizon and other telecommunications providers have actually not been giving schools the discounts that they're supposed to. They haven't been giving them the lowest fees possible. They've been charging them full rates in many cases for internet access.
Not like we need to look in depth at another case of social networking friending between educators and students, but I'm intrigued by this story about the Missouri principal who's accused of creating a fictitious character to friend students and parents.
Yeah, this is
this benign in any way, or was this actually malicious?
This seems like a very weird story. I mean, and I think that this is the thing with so many of these social media scare stories, is that they are they are, I think, weird anomalies rather than the regular practices of the vast majority of teachers and principals. In this case, this is a very odd case where there seemed to be controversy around the firing of the football coach, and it seems all sorts of a very sort of sordid affair in which the principal ended up making a fictitious character and friending a bunch of students and parents.
Okay, so this wasn't at all related to the kind of concerns like in New York where you have to operate anonymously, so nothing like that. This is some kind of weird story.
This is a weird story.
Okay, we don't need to give that any more time, do we?
No.
Google Hangouts on Air. That was a fun announcement.
Yeah, this is great, and I was actually thinking with some of the problems we've been having with Skype is that, I think that for me at least too, the Google Hangouts are the coolest part of Google+. And so Google Hangouts on Air that are rolling out to everyone over the next couple of weeks, Google says, means that everyone will be able to record and broadcast their Google Hangouts, which is great. I mean, so many potentials for classroom use with this announcement.
This has got to be a game changer at some level with products like Blackboard Collaborate and GoToMeeting and Adobe Connect.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to see, what this ends up doing. Can you use Google Hangouts on mobile devices?
Good question.
I know I can on my Android phone, but I have a sort of a high-level Android phone.
I don't know.
Can you do it on the iPad or?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure.
So, should we be doing our podcast live, do you think, with an audience?
Well, I think that would be kind of cool.
We should try it.
Okay,
listeners, we're going to make a commitment. Okay, so tell me about PathRight.
Yeah, we've seen a number of startups doing this. This isn't anything new, but again, I think that this is certainly an indication when you see a pile-on like this that there's something afoot. So PathRight is another one of these tools that allows anybody a sort of a formal classroom, whether you're a formal classroom teacher or not, to create online courses that you can distribute or sell, charge people to sign up. It's an LMS plus it's an LMS and CMS system all wrapped up in one. But, I mean, there are several competitors like this, but certainly this sort of excitement we have right now about online learning, and in some cases teachers feeling like they should do it themselves rather than go through institutional channels. I'm not surprised to see a number of startups move into the space.
So with organizations like Blackboard and CourseSite and Structure with Canvas, where you pretty much can go in and use their services for free as long as it's only a few classes. I'm not even sure how it works with Instructure, but is there a place for this kind of a smaller player, or will they ultimately get knocked out by the big players? I think that there is going to be a role for some of these small players. I think that they'll be for the kinds of classes that are the sort of informal classes, for things like, voice lessons, for example, or certain things that people would never have thought of using a tool like Blackboard in order to facilitate the class on. But for instructors that might be excited to actually hold classes online, but they never would have bothered with a more formal learning management system. So I'm imagining all of the kind of continuing education credits that lawyers and doctors and others have to go through.
Yep.
Seems like you could have a proliferation of people providing those services if the platform is easier.
Yep.
Okay, I love this Eastern Michigan University story. It gave me a huge smile. Every student in the school was informed they'd been dismissed due to their academic performance. Don't you just love that?
Yeah, I mean, there are some times when you hit oops and you email too many people the wrong message, sort of the reply all error. But I think this does take the cake in terms of the number of students, and and you can only imagine the shock and horror on the student body's faces when they opened up their email to find that they'd been expelled.
That was the laugh of the week. Okay, so Washington University Law School announces an online law degree to be offered. And then Saylor Foundation and Straight Line partnered to offer students cheap college credits. It felt to me like one of the themes running through all of these stories is this just incredible potential for diversity and complexity, maybe chaos. Mm-hmm. And is one possible outcome of that kind of chaos that ultimately those that learners are going to have to learn to navigate their own waters, and that's empowering, as Stephen Downes would say?
That's a really interesting. I mean, this is something I've been sort of stewing on this afternoon, thinking about another learn to program startup that I talked to this week, and thinking about just the options that exist right now in terms of something like learning to program, which is, I think, an easier skill to sort of imagine and sort of manage than something like a law degree. But even in that case, I think finding the right class for you, finding the right materials, finding the right instructors, deciding should you pay, should you use free resources. I mean, these are getting to be really challenging decisions, and I think that that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing. I mean, I don't just mean that in terms of sort of market competition or that this will raise the quality level of everyone's courses, but I do think that forcing learners to really take some time to think about what they want, what they like. I mean, in my case, with my experiences with the MOOCs, to realize, I'm not going to learn something through a lecture environment. I think that these are important insights for learners to have about how they operate best. Do they, would they function best in an on-site situation? Will they thrive? Are they, do they have sort of the motivation to sort of make it through a class that's more loosely organized, or do they need sort of a class with stricter deadlines, for example? I think that these are good things.
So we've talked about the potential for smaller institutions to really take advantage of this moment and catapult themselves to a different level of visibility or achievement. We're talking about learners becoming more responsible out of necessity for finding learning environments that are good for them. Mm-hmm. Will we also, do you think, see kind of a natural conclusion that with all of the proliferation of kinds of accreditation or credits, that it's going to become even more important for learners to learn how to showcase themselves and their learning well?
Yeah, I do think that's, I think we're already seeing, enough talk of sort of the resumes are dead, and the importance of having, I think that the connection to that is that the importance of having an online profile, and that it's really no longer going to be sufficient to say you have a bachelor's degree in anything, whether it's sort of computer science or English or philosophy, but you'll have to sort of demonstrate what you can do. And I think you'll have to have a place in which employers can find you and see what you can do online. So having an e-portfolio, I think, is going to be really important.
The University of Minnesota is launching an online catalog of open source textbooks and even paying faculty to contribute books and review them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the proliferation in open source textbooks as well. Sort of thinking about how many. I think that it's really interesting to sort of see this new market for free and open source content. But yeah, the University of Minnesota is asking faculty to write them and also paying them to review them, hoping to help uncover the best quality materials for students to be able to access.
Tell us about Kaggle. What is Kaggle?
Kaggle is an interesting data startup. This is it's a machine learning. It's a site that hosts machine learning competitions and data mining competitions. And so companies can sort of hand over their algorithms, so whatever their algorithms are that they work for, and ask anybody to participate in helping. It's a competition to see if you can improve on the algorithm. So sort of insurance companies, for example, have hosted competitions there to see if people who don't work for the insurance company can find better ways to sort of write insurance company algorithms. And there have been a couple of education related competitions. Grocket, the test prep company Grocket, ran a competition to see if they could improve one of their test algorithms. And just this week, the Hewlett Foundation, which has been running its automated essay grading competition, also announced the winners of its contest as well.
The Chronicle of Higher Education examines the growing number of people on federal food assistance who have postgraduate degrees.
Yes. I think this is again, it's sort of interesting thinking about the response that I saw to this article. In a lot of cases were sort of, silly graduate students, you should have known better, sort of serves you right for getting your master's degree in medieval history because there's no jobs, But actually, what the article points to is that many of these people are employed. These people with master's degrees and PhDs that are on food stamps, but they are employed as adjunct faculty, and they aren't making a living wage teaching classes as adjunct faculty. So I think we've touched upon this several times. This is a growing issue in higher ed as it turns more and more to adjunct faculty to teach its classes, and just doesn't pay frankly, just doesn't pay a living wage to do so.
A hard note to finish on, but again, Audrey, a great week of interesting thoughts from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.